A massive $4 trillion bill just passed the House that could change everything about your taxes, Social Security, and government benefits. And depending on your situation, you could either save thousands or lose critical support. In the next 12 minutes, I'll break down exactly how Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill affects your wallet, from new tax deductions for seniors to potential Medicare cuts that could impact millions of Americans. I'll reveal which income groups benefit the most, who gets hit the hardest, and the surprising loophole that could save you money on your next tax return. Information that could directly impact your financial future. Welcome to Financial Area, where we decode complex financial news into actionable insights. If you want to stay ahead of policy changes that affect your money, hit that like button and subscribe for weekly updates. Let's start with the changes that could put money directly back in your pocket. If you're a senior citizen, this bill includes some significant tax relief that you need to know about immediately. Under the new legislation, seniors earning less than $75,000 per year can now claim a brand new $4,000 standard tax deduction. This isn't replacing your existing deductions. It's an additional deduction specifically designed to ease the tax burden on those living on fixed incomes. Here's what this means in real numbers. If you're a single senior making $50,000 a year and you're in the 12% tax bracket, this $4,000 deduction could save you $480 in taxes annually. For married couples filing jointly, this deduction doubles to $8,000, potentially saving a couple nearly $1,000 each year. That's money that stays in your pocket instead of going to the government. Money that could cover utilities, groceries, or medical expenses that stretch tight budgets. But the tax changes don't stop there. The bill makes the 2017 Trump tax cuts permanent, which means the lower tax rates and increased standard deductions that were set to expire in 2025 will now continue indefinitely. This affects virtually every taxpayer, but the impact varies significantly based on your income level. Middle-class families have been benefiting from these cuts for years, and now they won't have to worry about their tax bills suddenly jumping up. The corporate tax rate will also remain permanently reduced, and there are some interesting new provisions that could affect your take-home pay. The bill introduces non-taxation of tips and certain types of overtime pay. If you work in hospitality, food service, or any job where tips are a significant part of your income, those tips will no longer be subject to federal income tax. Similarly, some overtime hours will be tax-free, though the specific details of which overtime qualifies are still being worked out. Now, you might be wondering about Social Security taxes. After all, there was a lot of campaign talk about eliminating taxes on Social Security benefits entirely. Here's the reality. The bill doesn't eliminate Social Security taxes, but it does offer a compromise. Instead of complete elimination, which would have cost the government hundreds of billions in revenue, the bill creates a new deduction structure. This means some of your Social Security income might be deductible, reducing your overall tax burden without completely removing the tax. It's not as dramatic as full elimination, but it still provides relief for many retirees. However, while some Americans are getting tax breaks, others are facing significant changes to the government programs they depend on. The bill introduces sweeping changes to Medicaid that could affect nearly 9 million people across the country. Under the new work requirements, childless adults will need to prove they're working at least 80 hours per month to maintain their Medicaid coverage. This might sound reasonable on the surface, but the reality is more complicated. Many people who rely on Medicaid live in areas with limited job opportunities, or they have disabilities or circumstances that make consistent employment challenging. The 80-hour requirement means working about 20 hours per week, every week, with no flexibility for seasonal work, temporary layoffs, or job transitions. Critics argue this disproportionately impacts rural communities and urban areas with high unemployment, where finding and maintaining steady work isn't always possible, regardless of someone's willingness to work. The enforcement of these requirements will likely vary by state, but the federal mandate means that states will have to implement systems to track work hours and verify employment. This administrative burden could be costly for states and bureaucratic for individuals who need to constantly document their work status to maintain healthcare coverage. Medicare, the healthcare program that millions of seniors depend on, is also facing substantial changes. The bill projects approximately $500 billion in cuts to Medicare over the next decade. Now, before you panic, it's important to understand what these cuts actually mean. The core Medicare benefits, hospital care, doctor visits, and prescription drug coverage aren't being eliminated. Instead, the cuts primarily target reimbursement rates to healthcare providers and some administrative costs. However, these reimbursement cuts could have real consequences for beneficiaries. When Medicare reduces how much it pays doctors and hospitals, some providers might limit the number of Medicare patients they accept or reduce services. This could create longer wait times for appointments, fewer specialists accepting Medicare, or additional out-of-pocket costs as providers try to make up for reduced government payments. The impact won't be uniform across the country areas with more healthcare providers, and competition will likely weather these changes better than rural or underserved communities. Food assistance is another area seeing major changes. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, commonly known as SNAP or food stamps, is facing expanded work requirements that will affect parents with young children for the first time. Previously, parents with children under certain ages were exempt from work requirements, recognizing the challenges of balancing employment with childcare responsibilities. Under the new bill, these exemptions are being narrowed significantly. More parents will need to work a minimum number of hours per week to maintain their SNAP benefits, even if they have young children and limited access to affordable childcare. The bill also shifts more of the administrative and financial burden to individual states, meaning states will have to pay a larger share of SNAP costs or implement stricter eligibility requirements to manage their budgets. This change could be particularly challenging in states that are already struggling economically. When states face budget pressures, they might choose to implement the strictest possible eligibility requirements or reduce benefit amounts to control costs. The result could be reduced food security for vulnerable families, particularly in areas where jobs are scarce or don't pay enough to lift families out of poverty. Beyond domestic programs, the bill allocates a massive $175 billion toward immigration and border enforcement. This represents one of the largest investments in border security in American history. The money will fund the construction and operation of additional detention facilities, hire thousands of new Border Patrol agents, and implement new technology for border monitoring. The detention facility expansion is particularly significant because it addresses one of the current bottlenecks in immigration enforcement: the lack of space to house people awaiting immigration hearings. With more detention capacity, the government can potentially process immigration cases more quickly, but it also means more people will be held in federal custody for longer periods. The humanitarian implications of this expansion are substantial, as detention conditions and the separation of families have been ongoing concerns. The hiring of additional border agents will likely have economic impacts in border communities, creating jobs and increasing federal presence in these areas. However, the effectiveness of increased enforcement in actually reducing illegal immigration remains a subject of debate among policy experts. One of the most concerning aspects of the bill for many legal scholars is the limitations it places on federal courts. The legislation restricts the ability of federal judges to enforce certain types of rulings, particularly those that might block or delay immigration enforcement actions. This represents a significant shift in the balance of power between the executive and judicial branches of government. These judicial limitations could have far-reaching consequences beyond immigration. When courts lose the ability to effectively check executive power, it can impact civil rights enforcement, environmental protections, and other areas where federal courts traditionally serve as a check on government overreach. Legal experts worry this could set a precedent that undermines the independence of the federal judiciary. Finally, we need to talk about the elephant in the room: the $4 trillion increase to the debt ceiling. This provision prevents the government from defaulting on its obligations, which would be catastrophic for the economy. However, it also allows the government to continue borrowing at unprecedented levels. Supporters argue this increase is necessary for economic stability and that defaulting on government debt would be far more damaging than increasing the borrowing limit. They point out that much of this debt is financing the tax cuts and programs that provide economic stimulus and support to American families. Critics, however, see this as fiscal irresponsibility that saddles future generations with debt. They argue that combining tax cuts with increased spending while raising the debt ceiling represents the worst of both worlds: reduced government revenue paired with higher government costs and more borrowing to cover the difference. The long-term implications of this debt increase will depend largely on economic growth, interest rates, and future policy decisions. If the tax cuts and spending stimulate enough economic growth, the increased tax revenue from a stronger economy could help manage the debt burden. However, if growth disappoints or interest rates rise significantly, the debt service costs could consume an increasingly large portion of the federal budget. So what does all this mean for you? If you're a senior with moderate income, you're likely to see immediate tax relief that puts real money back in your pocket. If you work in a job where tips or overtime are significant parts of your income, you could see your take-home pay increase substantially. However, if you depend on Medicaid, Medicare, or SNAP benefits, you need to prepare for changes that could affect your coverage or benefits. The work requirements for Medicaid and SNAP are particularly important to understand, as non-compliance could result in loss of benefits. For Medicare beneficiaries, while your core benefits should remain intact, you might experience longer wait times, fewer provider options, or higher out-of-pocket costs as the system adjusts to reduced reimbursements. The broader economic implications of this bill will unfold over months and years. The combination of tax cuts, spending increases, and debt ceiling raises creates a complex economic environment that could stimulate growth in the short term, while creating fiscal challenges down the road. As always, the devil is in the implementation details. How states choose to implement work requirements, how healthcare providers respond to Medicare cuts, and how effectively the government manages its increased debt load will all determine whether this bill ultimately helps or hurts American families. What's your take on these changes? Are you more likely to benefit from the tax cuts or be affected by the program changes? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to Financial Area for more analysis of how policy changes affect your money. I'll be following the implementation of this bill closely and bringing you updates as more details emerge.